So, for our third section, we are going to be talking about the Protestant Reformation. Now, you should have just completed a crossword puzzle that reviewed some of the major terms and ideas after reading the article about the Protestant Reformation. So, now I'm going to just kind of go back over some of those things and help you kind of connect the story and understand how this all came about in this time period. So we're going to start by talking about an event that's called the Papal Schism, because this is going to be an event that's kind of just going to lay the groundwork for the mood and the attitude of the Catholic Church in this time period. So for this first EQ, what we want to say, this event takes place in France initially. So we're going to say the French king was with the Pope, angry with the Pope because he claimed to be more powerful than the king. Because he claimed to be more powerful than the king. So this is similar to an event we talked about before where we discussed how England's King Henry II was gone to that conflict with the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas à Becket, and killed him basically because he threatened his power over his country. Well, the French king at the time was going to get into a similar conflict with the Pope because the Pope did the same thing, basically said, I am a more powerful figure to the people than you are as the monarch. So we're going to see this, like I told you, theme happen again and again. So here's another example of it. So then what happens is that when the Pope dies, the French king decides to hold his own election for Pope, decides to hold his own election for Pope, and he selects a new Pope, who takes residence in Avignon, France. And Avignon is there on the left part of your screen, in Avignon, France. So after the Pope dies, the French king looks at this as an opportunity for him to kind of take advantage of the situation, because traditionally with the Catholic Church, there's a very specific purpose and procedure for how they select the next Pope. And all of that happens in Italy and Rome and the Vatican. And the French king decides to basically circumvent that whole process. And he says, I'm just going to pick my own Pope and have my own kind of election, so to speak. And he selects a Pope of his own. And that Pope, he puts up in this beautiful kind of castle area in Avignon, France. And the goal that the French king had was that if he selects the Pope, that he more or less then can control said figure, because then the Pope is right there in kind of his own backyard and can kind of manipulate him and do all those types of things. So then the Pope will no longer be a threat to him and a problem. So that was kind of his master plan. Now, at the same time, though, so this is our third bullet, at the same time, the Catholic Church was selecting their own Pope. Catholic Church was selecting their own Pope to live in the Vatican in Rome. To live in the Vatican in Rome. And Vatican is right up there on the screen for you. So now what we have is the Catholic Church basically following the procedure that they had outlined to select a pope there in the Vatican. And so they do so. And now what we have is this event that we call the Papal Schism. And the Papal Schism is when we have two popes at the same time. So this is going to cause a lot of confusion and conflict between kind of in the Catholic Church. So for the next bullet, we want to say this causes the event known as the Papal Schism. And the Papal Schism is when the Roman Catholic Church has two popes, which divides Europe. Roman Catholic Church has two popes, which divide Europe. So if you're looking at the map up here that's on the screen, you can see this is showing kind of the division of these European countries because they kind of had to basically pick a side of which pope they were going to more or less call the real pope, which causes a lot of conflict in Europe at this time. So what we want to say for our last bullet about how this event is significant. So we would say that European countries had to give their allegiance. Allegiance is ALLEGIANCE to one of these popes, causing confusion amongst the people. So this is going to cause a lot of conflict because, as you can see from the map, the countries and areas that are in red would all respond to the Pope that was in Avignon and pledge their allegiance to him. And then all of the areas in blue were allegiant to the Pope in Rome. And then there are some countries that were just kind of divided depending upon the region, like the Holy Roman Empire in Portugal. So we can see a lot of division in this time period. So one of the things we also want to note for our second bullet is that this was the first sign of corruption in the Catholic Church. First sign of corruption, CORRUPTION, corruption in the Catholic Church. And then the last thing that we want to note about this event and why it's significant is that it was another example of conflict between monarchs and religion. Another example of conflict between monarchs and religion. So this is our second example of where we're going to see religious figures and kings and queens kind of butt heads with each other for power over the people. So here's kind of another example of that in this time period. So we talked about this event and kind of the corruption from this within the Catholic Church, kind of some of our first signs of corruption. So now let's talk about other examples of corruption that were happening in this time. So for our second EQ, we're going to talk about kind of some of the corruption coming from the Pope. So for the first bullet, we want to say the Pope and the clergy were responsible for providing spiritual guidance for the Catholic people. Spiritual guidance for the Catholic people. But they were becoming too concerned with politics and becoming wealthy. Too concerned with politics and becoming wealthy. So one of the things we start to see happen during this time period with the Catholic Church is where the church traditionally was supposed to be kind of the institution for spiritual guidance and, ways for the people to achieve salvation and all those types of things that religion are supposed to be meant for. Instead, the church focuses its attention more on kind of trying to control a lot of the monarchs and political figures of this time, and also trying to make money for the church for, lavish kind of expenses and things like that. So they start to kind of lose focus for what their intention is, and instead are putting it on things that are totally, misguided. So for the second bullet, we want to say instead they began to manipulate and change spiritual practices. To fit with their political and financial agenda. And that phrase is up on the screen there for you. To fit with their political and financial agenda. So to raise money and be able to kind of have their control over politics of that time, they instead start to basically kind of change their practices. So that way they can do those types of things and bring in money for the church. And one major example of this change in spiritual practices was something that the Pope decided that the church should do, which was a practice they called selling of indulgences. And indulgences, and what these are, were basically, they were ways that the church could give a clean slate, for one's sins. The church could give a clean slate for one's sins, which would help people reach religious salvation. And if you don't remember, that term salvation means basically another way of saying like get into heaven. So you might want to write heaven after that. Now, basically the practice in itself of selling indulgences would be that people that worked for the church, members of the clergy, would go out and basically sell, they almost more or less were like little slips of paper in that time that were sealed by the church. And the idea was that you could, for, a financial contribution, basically money, buy your way into heaven. That this piece of paper was basically the church saying, all of your sins have been absolved, and now you have a clean slate. We talked about how this practice initially kind of came about at the time of the Crusades because it was a way of justifying the killing of others in the name of kind of the church. And really, that was because the church wanted to try and maintain control over their lands and not lose their lands because lands equal wealth. So, again, you can see how all of this ties into ways that the church was trying to kind of maintain power and control and make money in this time period. So the selling of indulgences was one of those practices. Kind of in the same vein, they also, in addition to kind of indulgences, something else that would give you this indulgence was what is called a relic. And relics are this. We want to define it as this: believed, an object believed to have religious power. An object believed to have religious power. So, an example of a relic would be an object that was maybe held by a religious individual, maybe like Jesus, or the Virgin Mary, or someone like that, or even bones of saints or things like that. Would all be considered kind of relics. Now, what was interesting is that they found that this practice of selling these relics, which were also believed to kind of absolve your sins, like the indulgence, were oftentimes fakes and frauds, that it wasn't uncommon for people to be selling things like pig's bones or even, humans' bones or just different things, found objects, and claiming that they had some type of religious power, and that the lay person, being trusting of their church and religious figures, would just go along with it and spend their money on these things that were totally fake and frauds. So these practices of kind of selling these objects as well as selling the indulgences themselves was seen as very, very corrupt. And all of this, the last bullet, this practice went against traditional Catholic teachings. This practice went against traditional Catholic teachings, but was a way for the church to make money. But was a way for the church to make money. So all of this was very much driven by the church's financial kind of desires and needs in this time. So the corruption that's in the church at this time is very prevalent, very dominant in this time. And we have a figure that's going to kind of question some of those practices, and his name is Martin Luther. So who was Martin Luther is what we're going to look at in question 3. So for the first bullet, we want to say he was a Catholic monk. He was a Catholic monk and professor. Professor is Professor, professor in Wittenberg. Wittenberg is up on the screen for you. In Wittenberg, in the Holy Roman Empire. In the Holy Roman Empire, which, if you recall, is modern day Germany, is the region that we're talking about specifically for this. So Luther was a monk, so he was a member of the clergy of the church, and then he was also a professor, someone that studied religion and taught religion to others in this time period. So some of the things about Luther that are important to know, kind of his beliefs, we want to say he had more traditional beliefs about the church, had more traditional beliefs about the church. So he kind of was a little old school in his practices and beliefs. And so one of those kind of beliefs that he had, which was pretty much the central belief that drove his practices, was that this third bullet, he believed the Bible was the sole source, soul is an SOLE, sole source of religious truth, sole source of religious truth, and that salvation, and that salvation came from one's faith in God. And that salvation came from one's faith in God. So Luther felt very strongly that the Bible was basically the sole source of information when it came to religion. And he felt that the Pope and other members of the clergy were not following kind of the letter of God, which was the Bible. So he started to seriously question those types of things, and kind of wanted some answers as to why the church was kind of behaving the way they were. So he started to kind of question some of those practices. And basically, what that does is it leads him to creating this document that we called the 95 Theses. So for EQ4, we want to say for the first bullet, Martin Luther had many concerns about the practices of the Catholic Church, had many concerns about the practices of the Catholic Church. So he composed a list of complaints. So he composed a list of complaints and posted them to the Wittenberg church door on October 31st, 1517. October 31st, 1517. So basically what Luther does is he gets out, long piece of paper and writes out all of these different complaints that he has with the church. And those complaints then he takes and nails to the door of the church, which would be kind of in the center of the town, so that everybody can see, all of his issues. Basically, he was almost like kind of putting them on blast and tweeting like, here's all this stuff that I have, but just on one big document. And this document of complaints he called the 95 Theses. So with the second bullet, we want to define what that is. So the 95 Theses was the list of complaints that addressed practices, including the selling of indulgences, comma, the belief that the clergy should be able to marry, comma, and that there should be two sacraments, and sacraments is spelled SACRAMENTS. And those two sacraments he believed were baptism and communion. So Martin Luther's 95 Theses kind of outline all of the issues that he had and what he proposed should be kind of changed to in this time. So the big ones were his issues with the selling of indulgences. He also says that he believed that the clergy should be able to marry, which, if you know anything about the Roman Catholic Church, the members of their clergy cannot marry, even the lowest level, that basically they are abstinent and considered married to God. And Luther kind of questioned that and thought that clergy members should be able to marry and kind of put emphasis on the family and the home. And then that there should only be two sacraments as opposed to the seven sacraments that the Catholic Church has. And he said the two of the most important would be baptism and communion. So very much opposing kind of what would be considered heretical ideas of this time period. And so the radical ideas that Luther proposes are kind of instantly rejected by the Pope. In the crossword puzzle, you might recall that the Pope basically issued kind of this letter response called a papal bull, more or less condemning Luther for his beliefs and saying that if he continued to kind of spread these beliefs and say these things and not take them back, that he was going to be excommunicated or kicked out of the church. And that was kind of what's going to happen because Luther's not going to back down. And in fact, what's going to occur is his ideas are going to start to spread further in this time. And so for the third bullet, we want to say his ideas spread because thousands of copies of the theses were published on the printing press. So what we see happen is that the printing press, we talked about how that was revolutionary technology at that time, that is going to reproduce tons of copies of his theses, and they're going to start to kind of circulate throughout Europe, and more people are going to hear about his ideas and start to kind of agree with him and say, yeah, there are a lot of problems in the Catholic Church, and yeah, we should make changes. And what this is going to do is Luther, because he's going to get excommunicated or kicked out of the Catholic Church, he's going to kind of go off and start his own new church, his own new religious sect of Christianity. And this is going to spark the event that we call the Protestant Reformation. So for the last bullet, this event would be known as the Protestant Reformation and would create a new sect of Christianity known as Protestantism. New sect of Christianity known as Protestantism. So now we're going to have kind of division in the church, a breakaway from the church. And we're going to see now Christianity, kind of that umbrella of Christianity, further break down into kind of some new religious sects. And within Protestantism, we're going to start to see others kind of follow suit and create their own new Protestant churches, kind of following in the path of Luther. So for the fifth question, we want to say that Protestantism began to spread throughout Northern and Western Europe, and then at the same time, we want to say others were inspired by Luther's ideas. And created their own new Protestant churches. So others kind of take suit of what Luther is doing, and they decide, yeah, let's also kind of change and create a new church using the Bible as the source of kind of religious truth. And so we're going to see new churches start to kind of pop up in this time. So, some of the new Catholic churches that we're going to see, the first one is a sect known as Lutheranism. So, on your little chart there, under Protestant church, we want to write Lutheranism, or also known as the Lutheran Church. And we're going to see this church dominantly form in Germany, and Scandinavia, which we talked about before as regions like Denmark, Norway, Sweden, much of Northern Europe. Scandinavia is spelled Scandinavia. So the Lutheran Church is pretty much the church that Luther himself kind of founded and created following his break from the Catholic Church. Another church that's popular at this time was started by a guy named John Calvin, and this religion was called Calvinist or Calvinism. So let's put that in our second box on our chart, Calvinism. And this sect spread dominantly in regions like Switzerland. Switzerland is Switzerland, Switzerland. And then also the Netherlands. Netherlands is Netherlands, Netherlands. And then the last region is Hungary. Hungary is Hungary. So if you look up at the map, those would be the regions that are all kind of in that bluish color. All right, the third church we're going to talk about is the Anglican or Puritan church. Anglican/Puritan. And this church was located in England. And we're going to talk about this church more in our fourth section when we talk about the Tudor dynasty and how this church came about. So the Anglican church or the Puritan church. All right, fourth church is Presbyterianism. You've probably heard of a Presbyterian church. They're common in the United States. And Presbyterianism was the dominant church in Scotland, which if you think about our country and kind of ancestor-wise, many of kind of our early ancestors that came to this country and immigrants were of Scottish descent. So that would make sense that we see a larger presence of Presbyterians here in our country. So Scotland was the dominant part of the Presbyterian church. The next one is a group that's known as the Huguenots. And the Huguenots were a small group that were located in France. That we're going to talk about them more in a second, but they were a group that was very much kind of on the outs, especially in France, because France is still dominantly Roman Catholic and was going to try and maintain their stronghold on Roman Catholicism in that time, which is going to cause some conflict in that country. And then the last group are Anabaptists. And this is a church that was located in the Netherlands. And the Netherlands, just again, is Netherlands, the Netherlands. So we start to see kind of the rise of some of these new Protestant churches within this region starting to kind of pop up. Now, it is, though, important to note that while Protestantism became popular in some regions of Europe, this is our last bullet, we want to say that Catholicism was still the dominant religion. Catholicism was still the dominant religion. So even though we start to see more and more people joining some of these Protestant sects, the Roman Catholic Church still very much kind of had a stronghold on Europe in this time. However, something that is important is that in response to the growth of Protestantism, and here's just some examples of different church sects and the breakdown there. So here we go. In response to the growth of Protestantism, the Catholic Church tried to reform its practices, and bring back more people to the Catholic Church. So they really tried to kind of reform some of the corruption that they had. They had an event that was called the Council of Worms, which Worms is a place in Germany. And their hope was to basically try and fix some of these problems. And to a certain degree, they did so, but still we see the beginning of the Protestant churches start to kind of rise and grow, and how the Protestant Reformation is going to very much kind of impact Europe in this time. So let's talk about that now here in EQ6, what impact the Reformation had on Europe. So the first thing we want to say is that it increased literacy, which you should know is the ability to read and write, increased literacy due to Protestant leaders, encouraging their followers, to read the Bible for themselves, to create a personal connection, to the religious texts. So one of the impacts that the Reformation is going to have on Europe is that we're going to see more and more people of this time period being literate. And what that simply means is that people are going to be able to read and write more in this time period, because many of the Protestant leaders of this time are going to encourage their followers, their people, to read the Bible for themselves, as opposed to being told what the Bible said by said leaders, which was what was happening in the Catholic Church, where basically the religious leaders were the ones that would translate the Bible for the people. And they're saying, no, we want the Bible to be, what you are reading, so that you are making a personal connection to your religion and being more kind of devoted by understanding the text for yourself. So that's going to be an important change in this time. Second impact is that it increased the status of women. Since these churches emphasized the importance of marriage, and the role of women, as a teacher, mother, and wife. So with many of these Protestant churches, we start to see women kind of take an elevated role, an elevated status, because they believed that women were very much kind of the center of the home. And many Protestant churches put a lot of emphasis on the family and family units and marriage and things like that. So as a result, women kind of had a more elevated status and were treated a lot better within kind of this sect. So we start to see that as an important change in this time. Third change is that we want to say it conflict in some regions, caused conflict in some regions as followers of these new sects. Sex is SECTS. As followers of these new sects were often persecuted, and that term's up on the screen for you, were often persecuted by monarchs of Catholic nations. Were often persecuted by monarchs of Catholic nations. So what we mean by persecuted is that they were often attacked for their religious beliefs. This image right here on the screen for you is a painting that was done to try and capture the aftermath of an event in France that was called the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, which was an event where hundreds of Huguenots, French Huguenots, which was one of the Protestant sects, were basically slaughtered and killed and attacked by the Catholic armies of the French monarch at this time. And that this was a huge kind of slaughtering of this particular group because they had differing, religious viewpoints than the mainstream, French monarchy. Similar to that is we're going to talk about, when we talk about the Tudors, Queen Mary I of England was going to do a similar thing when she became queen because she was Catholic and persecuted many of the Protestant sects within England. So this is going to be an unfortunate event and theme that's going to happen with this new religion coming about in this time. And then finally, the last impact that we want to note is that this led to European nations' desire to colonize new lands, so they could convert indigenous people, and that phrase is up on the screen for you, so they could convert indigenous people to their competing religions. Then put a semicolon, and we want to say would cause wars between countries, as they all wanted political, economic, and religious dominance. So one of the things that we see during this time period is that this Protestant Reformation is going to spark the kind of emphasis on colonizing new lands. We're going to talk about the age of exploration in our next unit, where we see all of these European countries trying to kind of find explorers, people, like Columbus and Magellan and, Da Gama and all these guys. And they're going to encourage them to go out and kind of find new lands. And the hope is that then they can create new colonies of people that will go there and more or less convert the native people to these new religions, and in turn further grow and expand their population of religious followers. An example of this would be within our own country's history of the 13 colonies. And we'll talk about this more a little bit later, but the 13 colonies were kind of established by some of these various religious groups, examples would be the Puritans, Quakers, Anglicans, and then also Catholics that were all coming here and trying to kind of convert the Native American population and get them to join this new religion and kind of start anew here in this country. And so, what we see in this time is the Americas, which was one of the regions where we see kind of the discovery of subsequently after this time period, are going to more or less be carved up by all of these different competing territories and countries in Europe. And they're trying to gain a lot of power, both political, economic, and religious power in this time. So we'll talk about that more in the following units. So that is section 3. So now you can complete your section 3 quiz.